The following program is a PodcastOne.com production.
From Hollywood, California, by way of the Broken Skull Ranch, this is the Steve Austin Show.
Give me a hell yeah.
Hell yeah.
Now, here's Steve Austin.
All right, here I am. Steve Austin coming to the Broken Skull Ranch way out here in South Texas. Finally get a chance to talk to a longtime friend, Bill Apter, from the old Pro Wrestling Illustrated days, which back in the days, and we're going to get into this conversation, was, the Bible of professional wrestling. A lot of guys would go to the top 10 to find out where they stood in the national rankings. Bill, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Well, thank you. It is a thrill to be here because Bill Apter said so. Really
Bill, our history goes so far back. We're going to get into the MRI story and all that other stuff, but I know you're on a limited time schedule today. We're going to cover a hard 60 minutes with you, and then if you get another chance, come back and we'll continue the conversation, because someone that's been around the business as long as you have seen as much as you have, there's no way 1, 2, or 3 conversations can cover it. But nonetheless, let's get the ball rolling today.
We're going to be going all the way back to be talking about my days with Abraham Lincoln and all this kind of stuff?
Well, we could. I mean, Abraham Lincoln was highly underrated as a technical wrestler and probably had one of the greatest drop kicks in the history of the business. That's been lost, and some of the people who are historians of the business know this.
However, he got mad because he never made it to the number 2 spot in the rankings.
And people take the spots very serious on the Pro Wrestling Illustrated rankings. So let's just go ahead and start with that. The PWI 500. When was that started?
Oh, I can't give you an exact date on that. I'm not really sure because I've been gone from there for almost 14 years now. But when the editor came up with that, we all looked at him. What? Rank 500 guys? Are you kidding me? And we would have like board meetings. We'd sit in the conference room for days and weeks with people and all the editors just arguing, especially about who would be number 1. And we always got complaints from the quote-unquote smart fans that the number 1 guy was never like one of these specialized Japanese guys or guy from Puerto Rico or a luchador, etc. And we battled quite a bit to pick that top guy. And I'd say to pick the top 100 was really difficult. And after that, a lot of guys just kind of fell into the same numbers.
I mean, because, when you're talking about 500 guys, obviously that's a vast number. Now, once you get into that 100, you can really get a pretty good gauge on their activity on the national scale with the different promotions. 500. Now, 500 back in the day was one thing when you had all the promotions, but still, just the fact that you're trying to put some validity and real thought but behind the ranking of 500 people. So, I always figured that the Pro Wrestling Illustrated top 500 was a shoot when I ended up at number 1. That's when I know you got it right.
Oh, it was. Absolutely. Absolutely. And not only when you wound up as number 1, but when everybody there wound up as number 1. The most important 2 spots that we found out when I was back there in that 500 was the number 1 guy and who was Mr. 500. And there were guys that were saying, listen, if you're going to put me, 200 or 300, do me a favor and make me number 500 because everyone will know who I am. Now that 500 differed from the ways that we did the ratings. What I used to do, and this was back in the territorial days, and even when we did Pro Wrestling Illustrated Weekly, was I would call all the offices every week and speak to the promoter or somebody in the office to find out who the local champion is and who the top challengers were. So when you saw rankings for like the AWA, the NWA, the WWF back then, Florida, Charlotte, all of these places, including Japan. I had a guy in Japan I used to talk to, Koichi Yashizawa, every week. And we would go over this, and that's how the top 10 rankings were compiled generally.
And those guys were probably glad to work with you just to give their promotion some notoriety, some pub in a well-received magazine. Am I correct? Because, back in the days...
You are, I mean, a lot of people say we were the Internet before the Internet, and that's really true. I mean, I remember back in the 70s, Paul Jones, who was a big star in the Carolinas and in Georgia and a lot of other areas, came to Madison Square Garden for one show. Vince McMahon Sr. had booked him for one show. And he came over to me after he had gone into the dressing room area, and he says, you know what? He says, I never realized that. He says, you guys have been doing stories on me for a few years. There are people here who knew who I was because of the magazine coverage.
Right. I used to always, I mean, when I first broke into business, it was the back end of 1989. As you know, I was a 1990 Pro Wrestling Illustrated Rookie of the Year, and I have that plaque. I'm down here at the ranch, Bill, and I have that plaque hanging right on the other side of the wall here in my office. I was very proud to receive that award. But what are your first, as long as you've been around the business, what are your first memories of the business? Like growing up as a kid, what attracted you to the business? How'd you get into it?
Oh, growing up as a kid, I mean, my heroes, and it's amazing because I still have a passion for pro wrestling / sports entertainment from the day I first started watching it, and as we're talking today. When I was a little kid, my brother used to ask me to come up on the bed with him, and he'd go, move a little to the left. No, move a little to the right. And he'd yell out, drop kick, and he drop kicked me off the bed. It's my older brother. I had no idea what he was doing. And one night, I passed by the TV, and I saw him watching this guy, Antonino Argentino Rocca. Right. And I saw that was where the drop kick came from. So I started watching it with him. And then I remember this real cheap production show. I guess everything was cheap production back then, called Bedlam from Boston. And I was living in New York, in Queens, New York. And I was channel turning, and I saw this announcer and this wrestler named Dick the Bruiser talking with each other. The announcer was doing an interview, and Dick the Bruiser was really upset at one of the questions, and he pulled the announcer in the ring, beat the crap out of him. And I find out later that announcer was Lord Athol Leighton, a very well-spoken British gentleman, and that kicked off that feud. But something in that one moment and that thing with Rocca just sparked me. There was just, so little by little, I started Cowboy Bob Ellis, Johnny Valentine with his Atomic Skull Crusher, and then the guy that talked like this, pal, the Nature Boy, Buddy Rogers. When he came into the ring, all glistening and greased up and strutting and pointing to his temple and saying, I got it all up here, pal, I was hooked forever. I'm going to tell you a story off of that where I lived in Maspeth, Queens. I was so taken in by Buddy Rogers. There was a store across the street from the building where I lived called the Hilltop Luncheonette, and there was a gang of bullies that hung outside called the Hilltop Stompers, and they would just beat people up just to beat them up. So I would come out of my building every night around 8:30 to get the next morning newspaper, and I'd strut like Buddy Rogers, and they all knew that I liked this. And they'd all say, hey, there's Nature Boy, let's beat the crap out of him. And they'd beat the crap out of me, and I'd get up, strut, point to my temple, and strut back across to my parents' house across the street, and I did that every night.
Were they picking on you every single night?
Every single night. Every single night. That's why I looked.
Any stories of revenge? Were you able to avenge all these beatings one time?
Not from the Hilltop Stompers. However, I think I may have been the first backyard wrestler because Buddy Rogers did the figure 4 leg lock.
Right.
And I had an open challenge with all the kids my age where I lived in Ridgewood Gardens in Maspeth, that if anyone could break out of my figure 4, that I can still put on people within 6 seconds. I can still do this. Anybody can break out of my figure 4, I'll give them 25 cents. So we had an area behind the building of grass, and there were a chain link fence. So the chain link were the ropes, and the guys would challenge me every couple of days to see if they could break out of the figure 4. And only one guy did it because he saw Cowboy Bob Ellis turn it over and reverse it, and his foot went into my testicle so hard that I gave up.
so
but the area, but the area of grass that we wrestled on became a very bad place for my father, because we had created, from wrestling there, we had created a bald spot of grass in that area, and my father had to pay $1,000 fine for me and my friends doing that to the condo board. However, that bald spot, if everybody knows who I am, that became my signature now, because I still have that bald spot, but it's on top of the head now.
And with regards to the figure four, other than the testicular pain, which it happened during the reversal, that was leg placement. The reversal of the figure four does not automatically transfer the pain from the giver to the givee.
No, not necessarily. I thought it did when I saw Cowboy Bob Ellis turn it over on Buddy Rogers. I was, oh my God! But it seemed that Buddy Rogers was in a lot of pain at that point.
You seem you speak very highly of Buddy Rogers, as did Vince McMahon in all my talks with him. He just loved the way that Buddy Rogers strutted along the ring, in the ring. And, a lot of people don't know this, but Vince McMahon's walk to the ring was his version of the walk that Buddy Rogers, the strut that Buddy Rogers used in the ring.
Now, was it? Because I was told that it was a version of Dr. Jerry Graham originally.
Well, I actually thought it was a version of my walk, the BMF walk, but no, straight out of Vince's mouth, it was his version of the strut used by Buddy Rogers, because he just really looked up to Buddy Rogers. So, and speaking about Buddy Rogers, now he was obviously way before my time, but what was it about that guy that made him such a hot draw in that area and worldwide?
Well, first of all, I got to meet him toward the latter part of his career when he made this. I remember he had retired, and my dad and mom had retired to West Palm Beach in 1979 or so. My dad went to the matches there every Monday night. And my dad called. He says, "You'll never believe who just wrestled." I said, "Who?" He said, "Buddy Rogers." I said, "Dad, you need glasses or contact lenses." He said, "No, it was Buddy Rogers." And the next Monday, Rogers came back, and my dad gave him my phone number. There were no cell phones there. And a day or two later, I get, "Hey, Billy, this is Buddy Rogers. If you think I'm retired, you're crazy." And Buddy, the voice was exactly the same, the cockiness. I think what made him such a big star was, number one, he looked incredible. He looked like a real athlete. The presentation.
He carried himself like a star.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And he downed all the baby faces, of course, and sometimes he had a manager do it, but you always believed him, and you never thought anyone would beat Buddy Rogers. There are a lot of bad guys around that can do the job in the ring, but if you can't get across what you're going to do in terms of promoting what you're doing, then, there's a big link really missing. He had it all. He was just... I just remember him on the interviews, and I think I still have some of his audio interviews on old reel-to-reel tapes here. But there was he was a charismatic bad guy, and you can count those kind of bad guys on one hand, really, that can do everything. And his work in the ring was really, really good. Because he was a bad guy and he was champion, he got up and he was usually beaten up a lot. Everybody thought, "Oh, this next guy is going to win the championship."
Right.
But he always had a way of pulling it out and making you believe that he's not going to lose ever. Even if it's the last 5 seconds of a 60-minute match, he's not going to lose that match.
Hey, when you were talking to all the different promoters and compiling your top 10 list for Pro Wrestling Illustrated, and going back to, as many years as you've watched the business, was there any territory in particular that you really favored their style of work? But because it seemed like each territory is still pro wrestling, but had a different style. And you coming from where you're at, where there was Pennsylvania, New York area, more WWF country, correct? Or WWF?
Yeah,
but what was your favorite territory that you got a chance to cover and watch the work and the angles?
Well, back then, before Pro Wrestling Illustrated, we had the Wrestler and Inside Wrestling magazine. I always had a fondness, a personal fondness for those TBS days.
Yes.
The Georgia Championship Wrestling, and that extended down to Florida and also went back to Charlotte because, they ran a lot of the same territory. Of course, WWF was my home territory, so to say. We always knew we could get a good cover shot at the Garden and stuff like that, and I loved it. And Vince Sr. was terrific to me, with letting us shoot and all this kind of stuff. But there was something hypnotic about the way they did the TV in that little studio in TBS, where I never realized that, years later I would wind up, having my own segment on one of the shows there on TBS. So it came full circle. There was a charm, a smell, a feel to those old TBS shows. And, Freddie Miller was "Be There!" and Gordon Soley's unmistakable "A proboscis has been broken and we will be right back." And you couldn't wait for them to come back from the break.
Yeah.
You couldn't wait. There was an excitement. Every time they went to a break, there was a cliffhanger.
As a lifelong fan, Bill, and now, obviously we've known it was a work all along, but when I was a kid, and I'm a little bit younger than you, but when I first fell into wrestling, watching on TV, I was changing channels manually, just like you were, at 7 or 8. It was from the Sam Houston Coliseum in Houston, and I fell in love with the business. Now, I've talked to many people on the show, and they always knew that it was fake, and that's not the correct word to use. But they knew, they didn't know the term, but they knew it was a work or something was up. Now, me, on the other hand, I bought in as a kid. And later down the road, I would slowly go through this process of coming up with, okay, something's going on here, but it's not really fake, so to speak. So when you were watching, did you buy in as a kid? Did you always believe it was real? Or did you just know that it was a work and that's just the way it was? Where were you on that spectrum?
I never questioned it. When I was a kid, it was real to me.
Absolutely.
Like my friends were watching baseball and football, I was watching wrestling. Well, did you know wrestling was fixed? I didn't know it was broken. I said, it's a great sport. It's an absolute great sport.
Yeah.
It's one-on-one comp. But I looked the other way and I defended it.
Yeah.
From a young age, I defended it. I remember one time I was so mad. My dad wanted to get a new movie camera. And I said, it's Thursday night at 8 o'clock. And that's when wrestling was on from the Capitol Arena in Washington. They would see it in New York. And just as the store was closing, they had in the TV section there the Graham brothers against the Bastine brothers. And the four of them were bleeding like there was no tomorrow. And one of the sales guys said, "You watch that crap? That's all fake." I said, "Yeah, you don't know what's fake. We're not buying the camera here." And I made my father put the video camera down, and we ran out of the store. No, I totally, and then I never really questioned it. When I got into the business, they didn't know whether I knew or didn't know, but I never questioned it because we covered pro wrestling like Sports Illustrated would cover any sport.
Right, you did.
That's the way, and I never I never would go over to the guy, "Hey, how much time are you doing today and who's going over?" I never did that. Right. And I think that's why, 50 years later, I'm still here doing this because I never asked about, if there were times promoters would call me and say, "It would be a good idea for you to be in Charlotte next Wednesday night." Right. And I'd never say why. I'd go to Stanley Weston, my mentor who ran the company, and he understood. He got it.
Now, when someone would call you up, Bill, and say, "Hey, it'd be a good idea for you to be in Charlotte," and so you knew something's going to happen, maybe a big title change. Okay, now who's paying for the plane ticket? PWI or the promoter? Okay.
Yeah. Well, no, the company. No, we never took anything from the promoters at all. The company that owned Pro Wrestling Illustrated, Wrestler, Inside Wrestling, Sports Review Wrestling, etc. The owner of that company, the publishing company, London Publishing, was Stanley Weston. All expenses were paid by him. I was on a weekly salary. I wasn't a freelancer. I was on a weekly salary, medical benefits, everything. It was a regular job there. But I remember one promoter in Florida who hadn't called me, but one of the wrestlers called me. And one of the promoter in Florida put his arm around me afterwards, and he said, how did you just happen to be here tonight? And I said, didn't you hear? My parents moved down here 8 years ago. I'm visiting my parents, so how could I not come and shoot the matches here for the magazine?
Yeah.
Gave me a big smile, and he hugged, and he said, you got it, don't you? I said, yeah.
Gotcha.
So, yeah, exactly, because it was never said, but they always knew that I knew the code of ethics that went along with that business. Nobody had to talk about kayfabe and the code of ethics. I'll never forget the first time one of the first times I was in the dressing room, or second or third time in Charlotte, and some guy walked in and saw me talking to Tommy Young, the referee, and some other wrestlers, and the guy yells out, kayfabe.
Yeah.
Tommy Young looked at him. He says, kayfabe yourself. He says, this is Bill Apter. I said, oh, sorry. It's like, the guy knows. It's all right. And I never broke it to the fans either, because when fans would talk to me about, hey, this is fake, I said, listen, if you want to talk about wrestling, I look at it as a sport. So I'll talk to you about wrestling all day and night, but I'm not going to defend fake or real and all that. I said, these guys are the best athletes in the world. And this is, I don't question what this is. This is a sport to me.
This is the Steve Austin Show.
Hey, it's Adam Carolla from the Adam Carolla Show. Bet Online is the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for online betting. From the earliest odds to in-game live betting, Bet Online provides you with all the action and the ability to watch and bet on games as they happen, with the largest selection of odds on everything from football, NBA, college basketball as well. Bet Online has NHL, MMA, and championship boxing, all your betting needs in one place. Head to Bet Online today to get in on the action with America's most trusted site for online wagering. So have some fun. Make these games and these events and these combat sports a little more interesting with Bet Online. Bet Online. The game starts here.
Bill, you know how many days of the year the guys down the road, the grind is relentless. And so, that being said, with all the territories that you were covering, how often were you on the road? Because, it was the same thing for you. What was your travel schedule like back in the day?
Well, for example, if I went down to Florida...
And did you enjoy being on the road?
Loved it. I still do. I loved it, absolutely. My wife didn't love it, but I loved it. There would be times where I'd go down to Florida, where Monday night was West Palm, Tuesday was Tampa, Wednesday was Jacksonville, Thursday was another town, Friday was another town. Just follow the boys for the week. In Atlanta was the busiest weekend ever, because Friday nights in the 70s was the City Auditorium on Friday night. Then Saturday you do 3 hours of TV at TBS, then drive 3 hours to where Fred Ward was promoting in Columbus to do 1 hour of TV, and then you go do a spot show Saturday night somewhere like in Marietta, and then Sunday there'd be an afternoon show and a night show. So in terms of photography, I'd get 50, 60 rolls of film and, 20, 30 interviews during a weekend in Atlanta. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I was fortunate enough for a guy who was a wrestling fan to get into the business, not be one of the actual workers, even though I did that once, not to be one of the actual workers, and yet be sent all over the world. Japan 4 or 5 times, England, Italy, Germany. If it wasn't for this business, and I didn't have to pay for plane tickets either.
But Bill, when you mentioned Japan and all the territories, what did you think about the Japan style of work versus what was going on in the United States at the time when you were first going over there, and more of the strong style?
Well, I found Japan similar to a lot of the lighter weight guys that I'd seen in the United States. But remember now, I had gone on a tour. Baba invited me over along the Funks had kind of brokered that for me to go over there. And I was with Bruiser Brody, Superfly Jimmy Snuka, the Mongolian Stomper, Stan Hansen, Ted DiBiase. And so the style there was the guys that I was with were adapting their styles to the styles of the guys in Japan.
Right.
And to see the guys that I saw in America, like Superfly Jimmy Snuka, turn it up a bit and do his best in Japan against the Japanese guys was amazing. Probably one of the scariest things I've ever seen in my life. Nobody told me this was going to happen. I was by the ring shooting pictures. And I turn around and there's all these thousands and thousands of Japanese fans behind me. And all of a sudden I hear the dressing room door opens and they're scattering and running in fear and terror. And they're stomping all over the place, trying to get, I felt like Godzilla was coming out of the dressing room. Hansen and Brody swinging these huge chains, and they didn't give a damn who they were going to hit or whatever. And I got pushed down and like stomped on by these fans there. I'm telling you, it was like a Godzilla movie. Second night I wised up to that. I went under the ring. So Brody and Hansen got to the ring, but that was absolutely terrifying. But then you had, the great scientific wrestlers like Ted DiBiase on the tour, and I used to love the way the ring announcers are. Now DiBiase Ted. It was so different, and yet it still took place in four corners, and I loved it.
Man, I used to watch the same things that you were there in person, but I saw some of the things when Brody and Hansen came out swinging the cowbells on the end of that bull rope. And as scared shitless, quite frankly, as some of the people were in the audience, I mean, because it was a full-blown shoot. But it was almost an honor to get, it's like running the bulls. It was almost an honor to get lit up by that bell. They probably didn't want to get it again, and Brody and Hansen did not give a damn. And I thought, and of course, Brody was a big star wherever he went in the world. Stan, I thought more specifically in Japan, he was suited for that. And man, when you talk about working strong style, I mean, those two guys really thrived in that environment. And I also really loved, as far as your scientific style, a lot of people, Dory Funk, when I first started in the business of pro wrestling, I thought his style was a little bit more boring. But when I started educating myself and became a hand in the ring and a mechanic, I really appreciated what Dory was doing, really, in Japan. I loved Dory's work over in Japan, and he was a guy I really looked up to. But he was a guy that, from a famous Funk family, and of course Terry was probably the more well-known of the two. Dory's work over there, he would grind you. I was talking to Ric Flair the other day. He said he would kind of always lean on you and tire you out. But I really love Dory's style over there. Oh, yeah, I did too. And he and Terry, of course, their styles are so different. And what's amazing with Dory, he just came back from Japan. He was there as an ambassador there, but he still wrestles on his own Bang promotion regularly. And he's still doing it. He never stopped, and he's still got it. Hey, you mentioned earlier, we were talking about Buddy Rogers. Tell me a little bit about Jack Briscoe. Because I hear so many people talk about how badass Jack Briscoe was, but I really never got a chance to see him work. But any of the veterans I talk to speak with high regard about Jack Briscoe when he was the world champion or in the ring, period. I met Jack Briscoe the first time. Stanley Weston, my mentor, before I'd been hired full-time, he said to me, I got to do his voice, of course. He said, Eddie Graham is bringing this young, handsome kid, Jack Briscoe, to the Garden. You get an interview with Briscoe, and you can work for me full time. So, yes, Chief, I was Jimmy Olsen. Right.
He was very white. So I got to the Garden, and Eddie Graham introduced me to Jack, and of course, Jack did the interview. I audio taped it. Jack had this great deep voice about him. He could have been a radio personality back there. But when I saw him in the ring at the Garden, they put him against something like Carlos Parada or someone who wouldn't exactly complement what Jack Briscoe could do best. When I saw Jack Briscoe at his best, I saw 4 or 5 times his 1-hour matches against Dory Funk Jr.
Yeah.
And to this day, when people ask me to point to great matches I've photographed and seen throughout the years, because to me they're by every different era.
Yeah.
Briscoe Funk is the match. Jack Briscoe was just a fantastic pro wrestler, very focused in the ring. He didn't play to the fans. He was a plain guy. He came into the ring, he'd be introduced, he waved to the fans, of course, but then it was all business in the ring.
And it was highly respected as a shooter as well. So anytime you could work with him, and if you wanted to get smart with him, well, then he could show you a thing or two in regards to that.
Oh, well, he and his brother Jerry, of course. They were both fine amateur wrestlers. So you wouldn't want to cross either one of them, so to say, and have them shoot on you.
The Steve Austin Show. The Steve Austin Show.
Hey, it's James Altucher. I've been an entrepreneur, investor, best-selling writer, stand-up comic, and whatever it is I'm interested in, I get obsessed. Yes, it's led to success, but it's also led to such heartbreaking failure. I have failed more times than I can count. I wish in my life I had had people to talk to. That's why I started the James Altucher Show and bring on some of the most brilliant minds in every area of life. People like Richard Branson, Sarah Blakely, Mark Cuban, Danica Patrick, Gary Kasparov, and I wanted to find out exactly how they've navigated the highs, the lows, and everything in between. No fluff, just raw stories and real advice. I've talked to 1,500 of the most amazing people on the planet. So if you want to learn from the best and skip the same old canned interviews, we're all about helping you find your next big idea, level up your thinking, and ultimately to choose yourself. So let's do this together. Subscribe now to The James Altucher Show.
Steve Austin Unleashed.
Bill, what did you think when the territories started drying up? Because Vince was putting them all out of business.
Yeah, well, it upset me, of course, because I was one of the things that tied into the territories drying up, because the WWF at that point was starting to expand, was that we were losing material for the magazines. Right. Because WWE had their own magazine, and they didn't want the other magazines as part of what they were doing. So this was a situation that became very difficult to us. But to answer your question on a personal level, I hated to see the territories end, because, first of all, a lot of people were put out of work.
Yeah.
WWF did not take a lot of guys, so to say. But there was that feeling about the independent territories, that smaller, homegrown feeling at those arenas that even the indies today are still trying to bring back in some way, but it still doesn't feel like the days of those territories. The territories seem to be more official back then. You had the National Wrestling Alliance and all their territories. You had the AWA and all their little territories and stuff like that, and other promotions. So yeah, it was it hurt to see that go away. It really did, and that's why I remember so many good things from the territories, because I grew up in my career around the territories.
You had so many guys. I mean, so many territories. Guys would work in a territory for. Well, take Macho Man for instance, when he first started out, and then I guess it was with his father's promotion, ICW, and then went to Memphis, and then that's where he really honed his craft and came up with the Macho Man thing. And of course, by the time he got to WWF, he had been working 6-8 years and was already a hellacious worker, and then he went up there. But these days, without all the territories, there's just not any place for guys to really get on the road and work in front of any crowds and make a little bit of money to be able to stay on the road and keep learning.
Well, there are territories, there are groups like Ring of Honor, of course, around that's still a really good breeding ground for future stars. Of course, the WWE's got that magnificent performance center, and NXT, which I'm hoping, because I love that NXT promotion.
I do too.
The whole the whole feel of that's got that old school feel about it.
I agree.
And I'm hoping, so I'm hoping that's going to become a territorial part of what WWE is. But yeah, the territories, unfortunately, the last gasping breaths of survival, I was there at so much of that, and it really hurt. It really, really hurt. And you were in so many territories too. I mean, just all the years you spent in world class, which at one point everyone thought was going to be the next WWF.
Man, things were going so hot there, and then things all of a sudden, just kind of started taking a downturn when a lot of the guys and the Von Erichs, they started dying off, and it just turned into what it turned into. So it was a sad time. What were your thoughts on just the whole Von Erich legacy? And now as far as the boys go, you have Kevin as the only guy left. He's living in Hawaii. His boys now are getting into business. I wish them all the luck in the world. I'd be interested to see how their careers play out. But
it's a different business now.
Oh, it's a different business now. But what were your thoughts when all the tragedy with the Von Erichs happened?
Well,
you had to have been around those guys many times.
Oh, they had made me the fourth Von Erich. That's what they used to call me.
Oh, that's great.
I was very close with Kerry, Kevin, and David, and especially with David and his wife Trish. David and I met the first time in Florida when he was working for Eddie Graham, and we became really good friends. And he invited me along with I believe it was Craig Peters from Pro Wrestling Illustrated down to his ranch for a day. And we spent quality time with him, his wife, his brothers, his father, his mother, Doris. And I'll never forget, years later, it's the middle of the night, and one of my photographers, Kiyotaka Jimmy Suzuki, calls me from Japan, and he said, David Von Erich, he's dead. I said, what? He said, they found David Von Erich, he's dead. So what do you 3 o'clock in the morning, you can barely decipher what someone's saying on the phone, but you hear the word dead. And then I called him back after I woke up, which is 20 minutes later, and he confirmed, and it was shocked because that was the first wrestler I really knew well who died. And
you're talking about Jimmy Suzuki, the photographer, that's the one that gave you that call, right?
Yes. Yeah. And I was shocked because this is the first wrestler I ever knew who died. And I went down to the funeral, and it was one of the most devastating moments personally and business-wise of my life. Because here was this young kid who was slated probably to become the NWA World Champion. And I had just seen him a few weeks before, and he's dead. So, yeah, that, and then, of course, became very close with Kerry. And when he died, again, it was total shock and dismay. And then when the other kids, I mean, I talked to Kevin a few months ago, and I'm so glad that Kevin is here, that he's around, that he's content. He lives out in the jungle, he said, in Hawaii. There's no 7-Elevens out where he lives. But the legacy of the Von Erichs, it's unfortunate that too many people remember them for what the negatives were, the way that they all tragically died, than the great athletes and performers that they were in the ring.
I'll tell you what, man, coming from Texas and, world-class championship wrestling was a big part of my childhood growing up. I found that after I found Houston wrestling. And then finally, I got a football scholarship to North Texas State, which is in Denton, Texas, 30 miles from Dallas, Texas. So sure. I would pay my money on Friday nights or Saturday mornings because they went live on Friday night. And then Saturday morning they did the TV taping, which would air that night at KTVT, Channel 11. And, man, the Von Erichs and the Freebirds. And, man, that place was on fire. And it started,
right. Wait a minute. You just hit another great point, the Freebirds. Oh, my God.
Oh, man. But before you go to the Freebirds, I mean, the Von Erichs were rock stars. And a lot of people, if you weren't in Texas, you don't quite understand the grasp of how hot those kids were. Just good-looking kids. Everybody loved them. Guys and gals loved them. And then all of a sudden, when like Michael P.S. tells the story, he gets that call. I think it was from Gary Hart. You guys need to come down here. We can make some money. And they went out to check it out, and they were blown away with what Dallas was doing. I thought the Freebirds were phenomenal.
They were, listen, the combination of the Freebirds being rock stars, Bad Street USA,
yes,
and Von Erichs was absolutely incredible. And you mentioned another name in there who was such and I'm going to use the word genius in that promotion, and that was our old friend Gary Hart. He had such a great creative mind.
Oh.
Hart.
How well did you get to know Gary? Because
very well.
He gave me another job. I mean, once things in USWA had dried up a little bit, so I worked on the side for Gary Hart over at Metroplex Arena, and that's when I was a tag team with the California stud Rod Price. And so I didn't get a chance to really get inside Gary's mind for the business because I was too green to really understand the level with which he was coming from. But Gary was a very interesting guy, and I just had a great time reading his autobiography, which they were refusing to publish anymore. But what did you find about Gary that was so fascinating or just made him so, such a genius within the business?
Like they say, Nancy Reagan ran Ronald Reagan. I think in a lot of ways Gary Hart ran Fritz von Erich. He had
a lot of love-hate there, though. What a hell of a relationship those two had. Because
it was great. And one of the things, I have to back up a little. Gary was very laid back. He was very cool. It's very rare he'd get mad. And I'd hear guys coming over and saying, "Hey, Gary, what do you want me to do in my match tonight? What are we doing tomorrow?" And just very casually, and I got to do my Gary Hart, he'd go, "Oh, man, all I want you to do is go in the ring, do your thing, do 10 or 15 minutes, come out, get your money, come back tomorrow." That's how laid back he was. He was like that all the time. But when it came to business, Gary was an incredible creator. A lot of people likened him to the mind of Eddie Graham because he was always coming up with different angles, different storylines, and he was never afraid to give a young guy a break, or even one of the older guys who would come up with a scenario that Gary thought would work. And I happened to be toward the time that I used to go down to Texas to cover the matches where I first met you with your glowing blonde hair there. I used to go out with Gary, and Dick Steinborn was still around at that point. And we go and sit for hours discussing wrestling strategy. And Gary was just, I don't know, there was just something about him that even though he had family and all that, the only thing on his mind 24/7 was the business. He lived, ate, drank, slept the business. And that's what separates these great creators from the rest of business.
Well, you brought another name up, and you've said his name twice, Eddie Graham. Now, here was a guy who was also known as kind of the genius of finishes. So what was it about Eddie Graham that was just so special in regards to finishes?
That's a great question, and I wish I could give you an answer, but I don't know. I mean, he just seemed to, the finishes down in that Florida territory all seemed to be all right all the time.
I've heard some of the guys who worked in that territory, I mean, you'd basically have your match, which you would basically call in a ring. But in regards to the finish, I mean, that finish could be 5 to 10 minutes long. And whatever his instructions were, that's exactly what he wanted coming out of that match. You could do whatever you wanted, but when the finish came down, it was a well-thought-out process to lead to the next step to do business and draw on the next card that they were going to have.
And, he imparted a lot of his learning into his protege, Dusty Rhodes.
Yes.
Who took a lot of that and brought it to Jim Crockett Promotions when he worked for Jim Crockett. And he also brought, he was trained in Florida by Eddie Graham to do that.
Hey, Bill, before we, I know that we're on a hard 60-minute countdown because of your schedule today. But I know when we were talking last night, we were sending a few text messages, and you wanted to talk a little bit about some of the Andy Kaufman stuff down in the USWA. And I want to get to the Cascade story because you and me have a long history from when I first met you getting into business. But tell me some more Andy Kaufman stories about, when he feuded with Lawler in the USWA, and a lot of the younger generation don't know about this feud, but this was a hell of a damn feud.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, and Jerry Lawler will tell you the same thing, that if it wasn't for me connecting them, this thing may never have happened.
Oh, so you were the connector
I was
there.
the guy. Yeah.
What happened?
Yeah. Well, here's how it happened. Andy Kaufman used to come to Madison Square Garden, and he used to try and get into Vince Sr.'s ear to let him wrestle at the Garden. And, Vince Sr. wasn't into the whole showbiz aspect of this whole thing. So one night, Andy came over to me. He knew who I was from the magazine. I knew he was locked up.
Yeah.
Taxi. And he asked me, he wanted to talk, and I said, well, I got to go home. He said, where do you live? I said, in Queens. He said, how do you get there? I said, I take the subway. He said, can I go with you? I said, sure. So here I am on the E-train going from Penn Station to Union Turnpike in Queens with Andy Kaufman, the guy that's starring in Taxi, sitting next to me on the subway. And people are going like, and he's just saying hello to people. So we get up to my apartment, and at that point I was living with an Australian girl wrestler. She was my best friend. Her name was Susan Sexton. And she used to like when we had wrestlers up at the apartment there because we talked for the business for a little while. But he was, for 3 or 4 hours, he would be sitting there, and all he wanted to do is talk about Buddy Rogers and Fred Blassie and how he wanted to be Buddy Rogers and he wanted to be Fred Blassie. And I remember one night Suzanne was sitting on the couch, and we used the F-bomb on
This is Unleashed.
So she looked at him and she said, is that all the fuck you can talk about? She says, yeah, you know anything about the Ramones or AC/DC? And then she just looked at him, said, went into the bedroom, put on her headphones. We never saw her again that night. So I said to Andy Kaufman, I said, you have to understand that Vince McMahon Jr. is not going to let you do this, and maybe it's something to do with the commission, too. And Vince Jr. knew that Andy Kaufman was around at that point. He even had him, I think, broadcasting with him at one point. So I said, listen, I got a friend in Memphis, Tennessee. His name is Jerry Lawler. And I said, that territory they do shtick. They've got like the Frankenstein monster, different things like that, Dracula, and, maybe we go on it. He says, well, you think you can get me in touch with him? And I said, well, let's call him right now. And he looked at his watch. He said, it's 1 o'clock in the morning. He said, so we'll wait till the morning and call? I said, I don't know. He said, he's one of the wrestlers. He's probably just coming in. I said, we stay up all night. So I called Jerry Lawler, and he says, hey, Bill, how you doing? I said, fine. I said, I told him who I had in my apartment. And he pauses, and he says, you got Andy Kaufman, the guy from Taxi, in your little roach-infested apartment there in Queens? I said, yeah. He said, can I talk to him? I said, he wants to talk to you. So I put Andy on, and they talked for about 20 minutes. And Andy got off the phone, and he says, he wants to meet me. This is the guy that's starring in Taxi, the biggest comedy hit in the world. And Jerry Lawler wants to meet him, and this is the biggest thing in his life now. So from there, he went down a few days later, and Lawler and Jarrett and Jimmy Hart put the key in the ignition, and that got it going. So when the feud started and the Letterman show happened, I was also one of the people that helped get the Letterman show to book them as well. And I was at the Letterman show there, and I didn't know what was going to happen. I had no idea.
Right.
Because I at that point, if I would have thought to myself that this was a shoot, I would have bought that. Definitely.
Yeah.
And, eventually, years and years later, I never thought Andy Kaufman was a comic genius. I loved him as Latka.
Right.
He invited my wife and I down to Catch a Rising Star's 10th anniversary in New York, and he had a plant guy in the audience, and I didn't know this. And Andy came out after a minute or two of comedy. The plant yells out, Andy, what? Fuck you. And Andy looks at him and says, well, thank you very much. Fuck you. This went on for 20 minutes. Fuck you. No, fuck you. No, fuck you. And there are people in the audience hysterical laughing. I'm looking at my wife, and we were sitting at a table next to Liza Minnelli and a whole bunch of other celebrities, and they were all looking like they were all going to walk out. So I never thought he was a comic genius. And I remember probably 5 years after he died, he never kept in touch when he was sick, by the way. He just dropped out of contact with almost everyone. But about 5 years after he died, I found out that Judd Hirsch, one of the other stars from Taxi, was appearing in a show in New York called I'm Not Rappaport. And I don't know why, something compelled me to go and say hello to him. So I went to the theater, and he was just coming in. And I said, Mr. Hirsch, can I introduce myself? My name is Bill Apter. And I'm the guy who helped get Andy Kaufman into pro wrestling. And he put his arm around me, and he took me over to the side because he didn't want anybody else to hear. And he said, I guess you think I'm going to thank you. But he said, that was a miserable time for the whole cast because Andy missed rehearsals. Andy wasn't Andy. Andy was a pro wrestler at that time, and it hurt us all. He said, I don't fault you for it, but we never liked any of that stuff that he did.
Are you kidding me? That is amazing. But I mean, God, if any of you people want to go back out and watch some of this stuff, it's on YouTube. Just Google anything that has to do with Jerry Lawler and Andy Kaufman and just the whole feud, the whole angle. I mean, and these were back in the days. I mean, it was a shoot. Because
absolutely.
It was a straight up shoot. And then
Lawler now talks about it. And what I can reveal now is something I wouldn't reveal years ago, is that after the Letterman show, I went up to Lawler's hotel room with Craig Peters, and Lawler's wife was there, and Lawler invites me into the room and closes the door, and somebody taps me on the back, and it was Andy. They had just worked the entire universe, because the next day the photos that Craig Peters and I shot at the Letterman show were picked up by the AP wire. We ran over to Associated Press and gave them the pictures, and it was on every major newspaper the next day.
That's great. That's great.
Lawler, the day that hit, Lawler wanted to come out to our editorial offices, and Mr. Weston, my mentor, was like Vince Sr., no showbiz stuff. So I told him what happened the night before, and he wasn't impressed. And I said, can we send a car to get Jerry Lawler? He said, no, let him take the Long Island Railroad like everybody else. So here's the guy now whose face is on the cover of every newspaper, and he's taking the Long Island Railroad back to our office so we could spend the day having photos. So it doesn't matter how big of a star you are, if somebody doesn't buy you, you're on the subway. But yeah, had that moment in my apartment not happened, that the timing, everything, that thing might have happened, maybe, but I don't think it would have had the momentum, because everything just fired correctly from the moment that Andy and I met to let's call Jerry Lawler. I could have said, hey, let's call Eddie Graham. But for some reason, that Memphis territory and the way we were covering them in the magazine, that it was kind of like it was a brutal but shtick type of territory because they had characters. I knew this would fly there. I had no doubt. But there are other things that I've done that people don't know. Sylvester Stallone's office called our office one time that they were looking for a certain type to play opposite Sylvester Stallone in Rocky III. And the girl who called said, this is what we're looking for. And I sent this girl pictures of this veteran guy, superstar Billy Graham, and this new guy by the name of Terry Bollea, Hulk Hogan. So I sent it. They asked me to send it via FedEx. So the next day, I get a call from the secretary. Could you send us more pictures of this Terry Bollea?
Yep.
Which I did. So they wanted to talk to him. And the magazines at that point were banned from the WWF. We weren't allowed to shoot. So I called Arnold Skolin. I called a bunch of people. And then I finally called Hulk's mother, because I was always, since he started, I was always friendly with him, and I knew his mom and dad. And I used to, when the ban was on, anytime I needed to get the ban where the magazines weren't allowed in to the matches, I would always contact him through his mother. So I called his mother and I said, Sylvester Stallone wants to talk to Terry. And that's how that got started.
And I heard Terry thought it was a rib to begin with. He kept wouldn't call back. Yeah,
but everybody from Arnold Skolin to everyone in the office all took credit for doing that. I called Skolin. I said, could you give him the message? So Hogan didn't realize it. About 5 years ago, I told him the story of how this happened. I said, where do you think I got all the pictures for the magazine of you against Stallone in the movie? Your mother sent them to me as a thank you gift. He didn't know that.
Yeah. Hey, you brought up a real interesting name, a guy that I was a big fan of, Superstar Billy Graham. Back in his heyday, and you know, his DVD that the WWE turned out of him 20 years too soon. The guy was ahead of his time. Because when I look at what Billy Graham did, he was talking all that trash, and you know, he generated a lot of heat initially, and then he became so entertaining that the people started buying into him as a babyface. But then,
absolutely,
Vince
like
Senior,
the Road Warriors.
Yeah, but Vince Senior, you know, then he drops the belt to Bob Backlund, and he almost dropped off the face of the earth. He could have been really the first Stone Cold Steve Austin in regards to what he could have done in the business, but they didn't have the foresight then. It seemed, seemingly to me, looking back, hindsight being 20/20, but he was the original guy that, you know, all they had to do was transition his opponents, and that guy would have turned into a monster baby face.
Absolutely.
Do you agree?
Absolutely. And totally agree. And one of the great things I loved about Superstar Billy Graham is he was a great self-promoter. He would be in the ring putting a chin lock on Dusty Rhodes. Put this on the cover, Bill Apter. Put this on the cover, George Napolitano. You know, he'd call. He'd keep in touch by phone to let me know where he is. And when he lived on Long Island, which was just 3 miles away from the PWI offices, he was up there all the time whenever he wanted to be. I always loved people that went out of their way to push themselves because it was great for the magazines.
Right. But, man, I tell you what, he was just magic on a microphone. And just watching some of that old footage of him in Madison Square Garden where there was just a ringside interview or inside the ring with Vince McMahon, and even going back to some of the stuff, where would that have been in AWA when Wally Carbo was interviewing him?
Yeah, that was great stuff. But but when he was in the WWF, that was the peak of what he was becoming.
But he was in a zone, and I talked to Billy about 5 years ago. I said, man, the look in your eyes when you went out there, I mean, you were the superstar. There was no ifs, ands, or buts. You weren't trying to be the superstar. And he just had that look in his eyes that he believed 1,000% in everything that he said, talking about, you know, swimming across the Atlantic Ocean, lifting 8,000 pounds. It was all bullshit, as we know, in regards to promo.
Come on.
But the way he said it, I mean, it's like, surely you know it's bullshit, but it's so entertaining. I've got to love it.
Yeah. Hey, listen, before I go, because I see the clock's down to like 3 minutes here.
I know, we got to plug some of your stuff.
Yeah, well, OneWrestling.com is, of course, my home on the internet.
And that's the number one, not O.
The number one.
OneWrestling.com.
Number one. Like in Chinese food, it's number one. You can tweet me at Apter One Wrestling, again, it's the number one. But I want to break something on your podcast here because I haven't, a handful of people know this, but several years ago, a long time ago, I was approached by ECW Press in Canada. It's not ECW, the wrestling company. It's Entertainment Culture Writing, to write a book. And I put it off, and I put it off, and I put it off. And finally, in the last year and a half, I put it together. And they gave me a deadline, which was this past September. And the book should be out in all the bookstores and Amazon, etc., next year, hopefully in October or November. It's not a tell-all book. It's not a book where it's about what I did with the guys in the business. It's no, Apter's going to expose this. There are going to be stories like, for example, when I wrote an obituary in the early 70s of Bearcat Wright in the magazine, and then I got a letter from a fan, "You've made a grave error," and there was a picture of Bearcat Wright wrestling in Toronto the week before, that the guy wasn't dead. Stuff like that. There's the time with you in the MRI where I held your feet. You remember that?
Let me tell that. Well, I know it's going to be in the book, but here's the thing.
Yeah.
I'd gotten dropped on my head in Meadowlands, New Jersey. I was a transient quadriplegic for about a minute. I thought I was going to be paralyzed for the rest of my life.
I remember that.
And it was, I called an audible in the match. I told Owen, roll up for the win, because I had to get out of that match because there was a kiss my ass stipulation to the loser. And I wasn't going to put myself in that position. I was supposed to go over with the Stone Cold Stunner. Anyway, it was the worst roll up in the history of the business. But after that, they drove me to the hospital. Everything turned out negative. I had indeed bruised my spinal cord. I would find that out some months later. But anyway, you were there when I got that MRI, that first one in Philly for Dr. Torg's office. And Dr. Torg was kind of the leading specialist at the time for what is called, when you receive a blow to the top of your head, that is an axial load. Number one cause of quadriplegia. Some of the guys from NFL, have gone through that same thing. And anyway, I'm highly claustrophobic, and I started sliding me in that MRI tube, and I'm not the biggest guy in the world, but those tubes are kind of small as well, so it was scrunching my shoulders up. Yeah. And they would put me in that tube, and I was like, I'm starting to freak out a little bit. I said, all right, guys, back me out. And I said, okay, guys, I'm ready. Put me back in. They started getting me a little bit further in the tube. I said, all right, guys, back me out. And then finally, you were there because you were taking pictures. I still have some of those pictures that you gave me. And I said, Bill. And I had a pair of short socks on, those booty socks that I always wear. I didn't wear long socks because they weighed me down on my drop kick. And I said, Bill, would you please hold on to my foot so I know someone's here with me to get my ass in this tube? Now, you're talking about the toughest son of a bitch in the history of the WWF, and he doesn't want to go on a tube. So I relied on my longtime buddy, Bill Apter, to hold on to my foot. Because you know what, Bill? I come from the business of pro wrestling. When I figure, someone's going to pull a rib on me. Someone's going to put a cap on one end of that MRI tube and a cap on the other, and I'm fucked because I can't get out. And I knew that if you had my foot, someone would be there for me. So that's a true story, and I look forward to reading that and everything else in the book. And
that is, do you realize that those socks, we could have kept and sold them on eBay and never had to work a day in our lives?
Yeah, but, these are the kind of stories. But you don't need to do a tell-all book. A tell-all book is, I think, just covering the road that you traveled in the business of pro wrestling, covering from the biggest stars from the top to the bottom, but just a lifetime in the business of pro wrestling. One last question. Did you ever think when you first started getting into the business and getting paid for your work that it would last this long?
No, but you know what? I'm the type of person that when I like a business or a person, I'm totally devoted to that. WWF offered me jobs three times during the years I worked for Stanley Weston, and because of who I am, I didn't want to leave Stanley Weston. Because did I realize it would stay this long? Yeah, people ask me, when are you going to stop all this and retire like all nice old Jewish guys in Florida? And I said, never. Until I can keep doing this mentally and physically, I still love it, just like Vince McMahon. That glow in the eye is there every morning, and I can't wait to get up and do this. And just as a side thing, just to let you know that, a lot of people say to me, well, do you really want to do these calls during the day and all that? For the past 7 years, very quietly, I've been working for a nonprofit in the state of Pennsylvania and Delaware County for a company called AHED, AHEDD, and they're a nonprofit company, and the focus is to help persons with disabilities find real jobs, real competitive jobs. And last year, I think I placed about 20 people in good quality jobs, and the thing that I'm doing full-time with pro wrestling, I'm still there full-time, and I do that full-time as well. They complement each other because I meet a lot of employers who know who I am, and I can bring the message of what this company is doing to them as well. And I meet a lot of people, a lot of fans with disabilities out in the field who differently now, because even though I always helped persons with disabilities as a volunteer when I was a kid, it's a different focus now because, you can be out there and you can work. You don't have to be a shut-in.
Well, that's good work. Bill, next time I talk with you, I'd love to talk to you about some of the, Paul Heyman back in the day when he was snapping pictures. George Napolitano is another name that comes up. But just about some of the ringside stuff, shenanigans, because
we got to talk about your ex-wives. I knew every one of them.
Dude, that'd be a trilogy of 6-hour shows. It would be very sad. Hey, his name is Bill Apter, a longtime friend. And when I think pro wrestling, I think Bill Apter. And you can follow him on Twitter at Apter1Wrestling, and onewrestling.com is his website. Hey, Bill, it was good talking to you.
Can I do my sign off?
Yes, you can.
Thank you, Stone Cold Steve Austin, and for Stone Cold Steve Austin and Bill Apter here at onewrestling.com. We'll see you at the matches.
This has been a Podcast One production. Download new episodes of The Steve Austin Show every Tuesday at PodcastOne.com. That's PodcastOne.com.
Pluto TV has all the shows and movies you love streaming for free. That means laughter is free with gut-busting comedies like The Neighborhood, Boomerang, and Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Bueller.
Mystery is free with countless cases to crack from Criminal Minds, Tracker, and Matlock.
I'm a lawyer, like the old TV show.
And thrills are free with heart-pumping hits like The Walking Dead and Pulp Fiction.
Correctamundo.
Feel the free Pluto TV. Stream now, pay never.